At 4:17 on a humid Pacific morning, when the sky was still a pale, unsteady gray and the jungle mist crawled across the ground like a living thing, 8 U.S. Marines found themselves standing at the edge of a hill that should never have belonged to them. Hill 42 was nothing more than a hump of earth in a maze of palm trunks and dense vines, a forgotten rise surrounded by shadows and insects. It was not a strong point, not a defended ridge, not even part of the planned perimeter. It was an oversight on the map. But war does not care about mapped intentions. It cares only about who stands in the path when an army begins to move. The Marines had arrived there by accident. The previous night's confusion, the stumbling movements through tangled jungle, the scattered patrols, the misread compass bearings, had left them isolated, cut off from their company by nearly a mile. They did not know it yet. They only knew the air was wrong. Too still, too wet, too heavy. The kind of air that warns you something is coming. The first sign was the silence. The jungle, normally alive with the sounds of insects and distant birds, had stopped breathing. Even the wind seemed to withdraw, as if afraid of what approached through the darkness. The 8 men had taken up a loose perimeter, their bodies heavy with exhaustion after 48 hours without proper rest, but their senses held taut, stretched thin by instinct and memory. Then they heard it, a faint tremor, a soft, uneven crunch, the rustle of feet moving through undergrowth. Not one pair of feet, not two, dozens, no, more than that. Many more. The kind of sound that rolls through vegetation like an approaching storm, growing in layers, gathering density, becoming unmistakable. It was entire force. A Japanese infantry column was moving toward them, unaware that only 8 Marines stood in front of what they believed was the main American line. If they breached Hill 42, the gap would open behind the Marines' regiment, slicing into logistics, communications, and the wounded gathering at makeshift aid stations. Hundreds of lives lay behind that slope. The hill was unguarded, except for 8 men who didn't yet know the weight of what they were holding. Shadows began to form between the trees. Human shapes, rifles glinting faintly, bayonets catching the dim light. The Japanese troops moved quietly, methodically, stepping around branches, reorganizing in small clusters. They showed the disciplined calm of soldiers who had marched long enough to trust their purpose. And then it happened, the moment that turned quiet movement into something far more terrifying. A voice rose from the shadows. Not calm, not subtle. A rising cry, raw and violent, starting low in the gut and swelling upward with a force that felt physical, like a shock wave pressing into the chest. It was followed by another, and then dozens. The jungle erupted. The Banzai charge had begun. The cries shattered the morning silence with a ferocity that defied description. They were not simply battle shouts. They were declarations, visceral, unyielding, channeling a kind of ancient fury that slipped past reason and hammered directly at instinct. The Japanese soldiers surged forward, bayonets leveled, rifles held tight, bodies leaning toward the run. Leaves burst from branches. Earth shook beneath the collective weight of their rush. 8 Marines now faced what sounded like 100 attackers. They had seconds to react. The hill offered no fortifications, no sandbags, no foxholes, only the uneven rise of earth, damp foliage, exposed roots, and patches of mud. But the Marines moved with the economy of men who had done this many times. Their bodies aligned with the slope, forming short firing lanes among the trees. They steadied their breathing. Their rifles rose with mechanical precision learned under training instructors who yelled them into muscle memory. Their hearts pounded. Their hands steadied. The first attackers broke from the tree line, charging across the base of the hill. Their silhouettes lunged upward with terrifying momentum, faces strained, feet pounding the earth. The Marines held fire until the last possible moment. Then the entire hill erupted in controlled flashes of muzzle fire. The shots didn't just tear through the front ranks. They cut the charge in half, slicing into its center with punishing accuracy. Bodies fell. Others tripped over them. The hill lit with bursts of flame, smoke trailing through the leaves. Yet the Japanese troops did not stop. They surged again, stepping over the fallen, climbing forward with renewed fury. Grenades came next. Small, round, metal shapes arcing upward through the air with a faint glint. They bounced in the mud. They rolled toward roots. They landed too close. Explosions cracked through the morning. Moss and dirt sprayed upward. The ground trembled. Shards of earth hit the Marines' uniforms and helmets. Leaves blasted into shreds. The concussion pushed the men backward, stealing breath, ringing skulls. But the Marines held the line. Their palms steadied. Their rifles returned fire. Their discipline overcame the shock. Still the charge came. It rose in waves, each fueled by the same cries that vibrated with a kind of fevered resolve. The Japanese troops pushed again, emerging from smoke and debris like silhouettes cut from night. More bodies, more movement, more momentum gathering into a terrifying mass. 8 Marines found themselves drowning in a tide of attackers who should have engulfed them within minutes. But they did not yield. The hill grew slick with churn mud. Smoke drifted across the slope. The sharp scent of cordite filled the humid air. Light filtered through gaps in the canopy in thin, fractured beams. The cries of attackers blended with the hammered rhythm of rifle fire. And then, suddenly, the wave faltered. The charge slowed, fractured by the precise, punishing fire from the defenders. The front ranks thinned. Movement hesitated. The assault wavered with uncertainty. A false moment of calm settled over the hill. It lasted only seconds. But for the Marines, it felt like a lifetime compressed into a breath. Just enough time to feel the tremor of adrenaline begin to ebb, just enough to taste the edge of hope that perhaps they had halted the attack. Then the jungle gave its answer. A second wave of Japanese infantry emerged, larger than the first. The Banzai charge had only just begun. The hill, the morning, the 8 men. Everything collapsed once more into the rising roar of war as the new wave began its run. The Marines braced for the moment that would test not their training, but the very boundaries of human endurance. The second wave erupted from the jungle with far greater force than the first. Where the initial assault had come in a compact rush, this one spread wider, pushing through the trees in 3 jagged lines that funneled toward the hill from different angles. The Japanese troops appeared in the mist like dark silhouettes, multiplying out of the foliage, their momentum swelling with every step. The cries rose again, louder, deeper, vibrating through roots and branches, becoming a wall of sound that pressed against the chest and spine. The Marines felt the tremor of the coming impact. The brief pause between waves had not refreshed them. It had only made the fatigue more visible. Sweat dripped into their eyes. Their uniforms clung to their bodies, soaked through by humidity and exertion. Their ammunition was already thinner than it should have been at this stage of the battle. Their arms ached from recoil. Their lungs burned from smoke. And yet none of that changed what stood before them. The second wave was larger, sharper, more coordinated. The Marines adjusted positions by inches, aligning their fire lanes to accommodate the broader attack vectors. They pressed themselves deeper into the slope, using the uneven rise as partial cover. The jungle canopy filtered early morning light into a shifting pattern of bright and dark strips that danced across the hillside, adding confusion to the scene. Shadows flickered everywhere. Movement felt omnipresent. Then the attackers reached the foot of Hill 42. The Marines fired. The slope lit up with crackling bursts of controlled fire, short, precise shots that cut through the advancing mass with quiet discipline. Each Marine focused on his own sector, maintaining the invisible overlapping arcs that had formed instinctively the moment the first wave hit. Spent brass bounced down the hill in small metallic cascades. Muzzle flashes blinked between branches. Smoke unfurled in tight, drifting coils. But the second wave did not falter. If anything, the fire seemed to feed their momentum. They surged upward. One cluster broke off from the left flank, using the thick vegetation to mask their approach. They moved with coordinated speed, crouched low, advancing in bursts through patches of shadow. Their intention was clear: reach the Marines' left side, break the perimeter, force a collapse inward. Another group drove straight up the middle with frightening determination, stepping over the fallen, charging through bursts of fire with a refusal that bordered on the unreal. It was the kind of advance that ignored pain, ignored loss, ignored reason, driven by something deeper, something carved into the identity of the soldier. Explosions detonated near the Marines' positions. Dirt exploded upward into the canopy, showering the slope with debris. The concussive force shook leaves from branches, turning the air into a storm of drifting green fragments. The Marines steadied themselves, pressed lower, and resumed firing. For every attacker that fell, two more seemed to take his place. The first moment of real danger arrived on the left flank. A group of Japanese troops managed to get within 20 yards of the slope, slipping through a patch where the vegetation thickened into a natural cover. Their movement was fast, almost silent. They crawled through ferns and roots, emerging periodically to gauge distance. The Marines shifted fire, but the cluster kept coming, using the terrain like a shield. The charge shifted again. More shapes appeared on the right side, pushing through palms in sudden bursts of motion. The center wave continued up the front with steady determination. The three lines were closing in, converging on the 8 Marines from angles too wide to cover evenly. The hill trembled with footsteps. For a moment, it seemed inevitable that they would be overrun. Then something unexpected happened, something no one had prepared for, something that fractured the rhythm of the Japanese attack. Sudden fire erupted from deep within the jungle. Not from the Marines, from behind the second wave. Short, sharp bursts, rapid, disciplined, unmistakably different from the chaotic spray of a charge. The Japanese attackers hesitated. Some froze in mid-step. The formation wavered, turning slightly as if trying to identify the source of the new fire. It was one of their own machine guns accidentally triggered in the rush, an operator stumbling or falling, sending stray rounds into the backs of the charging infantry. The fire wasn't heavy, but the shock of it, the momentary confusion, rippled through the assault with a force comparable to an explosion. The Marines recognized the hesitation instantly. They seized it. Their fire sharpened, struck deeper, dug into the moment of vulnerability with precision born not of calm, but of desperation. The second wave, momentarily disoriented, fell under the renewed onslaught. Bodies collapsed in the mud. The cries faltered. Movement slowed. Then, like the tide after a crashing wave, the assault receded. It did not break completely. The attackers withdrew only far enough to regroup. Their silhouettes slipped back into the jungle shadows, leaving behind a hillside scarred with churned earth, scattered debris, and fallen bodies. The Marines finally breathed. Not relief, just breath. Just the simple involuntary intake of air, as if the body remembered suddenly that it needed oxygen to live. The hill was no longer a hill. It was a battlefield compressed into a patch of earth smaller than a football field. Smoke drifted in thin veils. The ground bore fresh craters from grenades. The tree trunks were carved with bullet tracks. Small fires burned in patches of brush, flickering like weak candles in the damp morning. The Marines checked themselves. Each man touched arms, legs, chest, feeling for wounds in the adrenaline haze. Some had shrapnel in shoulders or arms. Others had ears ringing from shockwaves. Their uniforms were torn. Their helmets carried fresh dents. But all 8 were alive. It felt almost impossible. They had survived 2 waves. But the jungle had not finished with them. It waited, silent again, listening, watching. The stillness lasted only long enough for the Marines to understand that the worst had not yet come. It was the kind of silence that feels deliberate, like the pause between breaths before a deeper, heavier exhalation. And then, from deeper within the trees, another sound emerged. Not footsteps, not cries, drums. A slow, rhythmic pounding that rolled like thunder through the foliage. It vibrated through the soil, traveled through the roots, and settled in the bones. A sound meant not to conceal, but to announce. The Japanese troops were preparing for a full-scale Banzai assault. Not a wave, not a rush. A massed, all-or-nothing charge. Hundreds of soldiers committing to a single, focused breakthrough. The 8 Marines looked at one another without speaking, without moving, without the luxury of fear. They knew what this meant. They knew what was coming. They knew how these assaults ended. They would not survive it. That truth settled over the hill like a second mist. But there were no reinforcements, no retreat paths, no fallback positions. Hill 42 had become a hinge on which the safety of an entire battalion turned. If the Japanese broke through here, they would spill into the rear lines, into the medics, the wounded, the supply stations. So 8 men prepared to hold a hill against an army. The drums grew louder. The ground began to tremble again. The third assault was coming. And this time, it would be larger than anything the Marines had faced in their lives. The drums did not merely echo through the jungle. They consumed it. Each strike carried weight, a dull, rhythmic impact that pushed deeper into the soil, shaking loose fragments of earth down the hill's slope. The jungle canopy trembled. Small insects rose from the underbrush in confused clouds. The early light dimmed as mist thickened around the trees, creating a curtain of pale vapor that concealed everything except sound. And within that growing fog of war, the Marines sensed the gathering of a force so large it felt less like an army and more like a natural disaster. 8 men stood alone on Hill 42, watching as the world below them shifted from stillness into something far more ominous. The first shapes appeared in the fog, dark, blurred outlines moving with slow, deliberate steps. They advanced not in scattered groups or narrow lines, but as a dense formation filling the jungle floor. Bayonets pointed forward, rifles gripped tight. Officers positioned along the flanks raised their arms in unison. The troops halted, standing in rows like statues, silent except for the steady drums. This was no ordinary Banzai rush. It was a coordinated, ritualized assault, an entire Japanese company preparing to break through a single small hill. Their discipline was chilling. Their silence was worse. It felt like watching a force inhale collectively before releasing everything inside. The Marines adjusted their positions, not out of confidence, but out of the silent understanding that only preparation stood between life and annihilation. They redistributed ammunition, dividing the remaining magazines into even stacks. They rechecked the terrain, memorizing every route, every depression, every outcropping of earth that could offer a fraction of protection. Their hands trembled not from fear, but from exhaustion creeping into their bones after hours of unbroken tension. Then the drums stopped. The jungle froze, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any sound. It lasted long enough for the Marines to feel their heartbeats echoing off the inside of their helmets. Long enough for a thin breeze to move through the foliage, stirring the mist into swirling ribbons. Long enough for doubt to slip into the edges of their minds. Then the jungle exhaled. A single voice rose, long, drawn out, and deafening. It cut through the fog like a blade. The cry swelled and multiplied as hundreds of Japanese soldiers erupted forward in a unified burst of fury. They surged across jungle floor like a tidal wave of bodies, crashing uphill in fluid, relentless motion. The Banzai charge had begun in full. The Marines opened fire. Their rifles cracked in rapid succession, filling the air with flashes that tore through mist like streaks of lightning. Brass casings scattered across the mud. Smoke rose in thin streams. Each Marine fired with deliberate rhythm, choosing targets with disciplined precision rather than panic. The front lines of the assault buckled. Men fell, stumbled, rolled backward, but the wave behind them closed the gap immediately. The slope shook under the assault. Grenades landed on the hilltop, exploding with violent bursts of dirt and debris. The Marines ducked low, battered by concussive force. Their helmets rang. Dust filled their lungs. But they rose again to fire. They had no other choice. The charge did not slow. It grew stronger with each second. The attackers reached the lower half of the hill. Their feet pounded against the slope, mud splattering behind them. Bayonets glinted through the haze like shards of broken glass. The distance between the two sides collapsed rapidly. 10 yards. 8. 6. The Marines shifted to tighter firing arcs, aiming at silhouettes now close enough that their faces emerged from mist. Faces contorted with exhaustion, fear, rage, and determination. Yet despite everything, the hill held. The ground beneath the Marines became a mixture of churned earth, broken vegetation, and the remains of the first two waves. Smoke blurred the edges of vision. Every breath tasted of metal and soil. But the Marines did not retreat. Their fire stayed sharp. Their movements stayed steady. Their senses stayed focused on the single truth that mattered. They had to hold a line meant for 50 men, and they would do it with 8. Then the line broke, just not where they expected. A cluster of Japanese soldiers suddenly emerged from the right flank, having pushed through a narrow gap in the vegetation where visibility had been poor. They had bypassed the main slope and were now climbing toward the Marine side, a fatal angle if they gained just a few more yards. The Marines shifted, firing bursts that cut through the new threat. But the sudden change in angle forced them to expose their center for a fraction of a second, and the center wave seized it. More attackers surged upward in a concentrated burst of movement, slipping behind fallen branches and small trenches carved by grenade blasts. The hill echoed with the sound of boots clawing through mud, the scrape of steel, the shouted intensity of bodies straining past physical limits. The Marines fired until their rifles struck empty magazines. They reloaded with trembling fingers. They fired again. The air burned around them from heat and friction. Sweat mixed with dust, forming a thin paste across their skin. Their muscles screamed. Their hands cramped. But retreat was not an option. The charge reached the middle of the hill. The battle collapsed into a chaotic crush of bodies. The Marines felt the earth tremble beneath their boots as dozens of attackers closed the remaining distance. Bayonets thrust upward, slicing through air. Grenades tumbled dangerously close before rolling downhill. One detonation knocked a Marine sideways, leaving him dazed but alive. Another explosion showered the slope with fragments that sliced through sleeves and gear. The attackers were now close enough that rifles became unwieldy. The Marines used the terrain, letting gravity and slope break the attackers' footing. They moved just enough to maintain advantage, firing in short downward bursts that punished every attempt to climb. The hilltop became a series of desperate stands separated by only seconds of breathing room. The Japanese troops attacked with terrifying resolve. For every one that fell, another took his place. The hilltop felt like a narrowing platform above a rising sea, each wave higher than the last, each one crashing harder. Then, unexpectedly, the intensity fractured. A sudden explosion erupted deeper in the jungle, not from the front, but from the rear of the Japanese formation. A mortar shell, miscalculated in haste, detonated among their own ranks. The blast tore open the center of their advance, sending soldiers tumbling in all directions. A plume of dirt and smoke shot upward, momentarily blinding the approaching wave. The Marines seized the opening. Their fire sharpened once more. Their angles tightened. Their exhaustion fell away in the face of the momentary shift. They pushed with every remaining ounce of strength to exploit the hesitation. The line held again. The third wave, like the second, began to fall apart. The attackers withdrew into the mist, dragging wounded comrades, regrouping for another push. Their cries receded. Their footsteps softened. The jungle reclaimed the noise. And once again, silence enveloped the hill. But this silence was not a pause. It was the moment before the storm becomes something greater. The Marines' chests heaved with ragged breaths. Their legs trembled beneath them. Their ammunition was dangerously low. Some had more cuts than clean skin. Others blinked through ringing in their ears. And all 8 knew the truth. The next wave would be the last. Not because the Japanese would stop, but because the Marines could not hold much longer. Far below, the jungle shifted again. This time, the movement was heavier, slower, coordinated with frightening precision. The Japanese officers were assembling every remaining soldier for one final, overwhelming assault. A Banzai charge that would throw every available man at the hill in a single, massive surge. Hundreds of attackers against 8 Marines who could barely stand. The drums began again, slower, deeper, more final, and the hill, battered and smoking, waited for the moment that would decide everything. The drums rolled slower now, each strike spaced like a heartbeat at the edge of failure. The sound no longer carried the frantic urgency of an immediate rush. It carried something heavier, something final. The jungle did not resist. It seemed to lean in, listening. Mist coiled between trunks and low branches, thickening into pale veils that softened the shapes below the hill. The dawn light had fully broken, but beneath the canopy it remained dim. The colors washed out into muted greens and browns. 8 Marines lay pressed against the slope of Hill 42, surrounded by torn earth, splintered roots, and spent brass, their bodies shaking with exhaustion, their minds hovering at the thin line where instinct overrides fear. They had already faced 3 waves that should have broken them. Each one had torn another piece from their strength. Their ammunition was nearly gone. Their throats were raw from dust and smoke. Their muscles burned with the kind of deep fatigue that no brief rest could erase. Yet the hill still held. Behind it, out of sight beyond the trees and folds of terrain, lay the aid stations, supply points, and resting troops of their regiment. Men who did not know, in that moment, how narrow the barrier was between relative safety and violent ruin. The 8 Marines were that barrier, and the jungle was about to test whether it could be shattered. Movement appeared again below, this time not in scattered clusters, but in a broad, dark swath that filled the spaces between trunks. The Japanese force advanced in a dense mass, rows of helmets and rifles and bayonets emerging through the mist. There was no hesitation now, no probing, no measured advance. This was a commitment of everything remaining. Officers moved along the flanks, swords raised, arms sweeping forward in sharp commands. The soldiers aligned into rough lines, stepping over the fallen from previous waves with a grim efficiency that recognized only the objective ahead. Hill 42 was no longer just a patch of ground. It was an obstacle that had defied 3 full assaults. It had to be taken. It would be taken, or they would die trying. The cries rose again. They came not as isolated shouts, but as a single, layered roar that built upon itself until it seemed to press the air upward from the ground. The sound rolled toward the hill like a physical wave, crashing into the ears and chests of the defenders. This was not just aggression. It was declaration, an audible vow that this charge would not stop until it reached the crest. The Marines tightened their grips on weapons that felt heavier than they had an hour before. They checked their remaining ammunition with quick, practiced movements. Pouches that should have been full now rattled only faintly. Magazines lay in short stacks, each one a shrinking buffer between coherent defense and hand-to-hand chaos. They adjusted their firing positions, angling themselves to cover as much of the slope as possible. There was no talk of retreat, not because they were fearless, but because retreat had nowhere to go. The jungle behind them did not lead to safety. It led to the interior of a position that would be ripped apart if they abandoned this hill. The third silence of the morning fell, not the silence of calm, but the silence of two forces inhaling at the same time. Then the world broke open. The charge surged forward. Hundreds of boots ripped through the undergrowth and found purchase on the lower slope. Bayonets glinted in ragged rows. Some attackers fired as they ran, but most committed to the forward momentum, rifles held like spears, eyes fixed on a rise above. The cries did not falter. They intensified, as if volume alone could break the hill. The Marines opened fire. Their rifles cracked in a controlled, almost mechanical rhythm that belied the chaos before them. Each shot was chosen, each burst measured. They aimed low into the dense front, using the mass against itself. Men fell. Others stumbled over them, tripping, collapsing, sliding back down. But there were always more behind. Bodies rolled, then vanished beneath the feet of those still advancing. The slope began to change shape beneath the accumulated weight of falling and climbing men. Grenades arced upward from the charging ranks, spinning briefly in the air before landing on the hillside. Explosions punched small craters into the ground, tearing up foliage and dirt and fragments of equipment. The concussive force hammered the Marines' ears and chests, leaving their hearing muffled and their balance unsteady. They fought through the disorientation, clinging to training that had been drilled into them long before they ever saw a jungle. Fire. Breathe. Reload. Fire again. The range shrank. What had started as a distant line became a living wall of bodies. 10 yards. 8. 5. The charge hit the steepest part of the slope and slowed, not from lack of will, but from the sheer difficulty of climbing under fire. The Marines adjusted their aim downward, using gravity and terrain as allies. Bullets tore through legs and hips. Men tumbled backward into those climbing behind them, creating momentary knots of confusion. The hilltop became an anchor against which the assault broke again and again, but this time the strain on that anchor was almost unbearable. The left flank collapsed first, not from enemy success, but from sheer pressure. One Marine there had taken shrapnel in the shoulder. Another had lost most of his ammunition. Their fire slackened just enough that a cluster of attackers seized the moment and surged higher, reaching a patch of ground only a short sprint from the crest. The Marine closest to that gap recognized the danger with the clarity that comes when there is no time for doubt. He shifted his entire position downslope, exposing himself to fire from the center wave, but cutting into the advancing cluster with a brutal volley. 3 attackers fell. 2 more stumbled and dropped. The cluster's momentum shattered, buying the defenders a few more seconds that felt like an hour. But the move cost him. A grenade detonated close by, knocking him flat, his rifle skidding from his grip. He did not rise immediately. Another Marine shifted to cover his sector. The line bent but did not break. On the right side, the situation was even worse. Several attackers had managed to crawl into a shallow fold in the terrain, hidden from direct fire. From there, they began to crawl upward, using roots and rocks for leverage, slowly closing the gap to the crest. The Marines on that side saw only glimpses, a helmet edge, a sleeve, a bayonet tip. Their bullets chewed into the ground inches from the creeping figures. The attackers kept moving. When they reached within a few body lengths, one of the Marines on the right flank seized his last grenade, pulled the pin with clumsy, shaking hands, and rolled it downslope into the fold. It bounced once, twice, then disappeared into the shallow depression. The explosion lifted bodies out of the fold in a violent burst of dirt and limbs. The immediate threat vanished in a cloud of mud and smoke. But each desperate act cost ammunition, strength, and time. and time now belonged to the attackers. The mass still climbed. The cries still rose. The hilltop grew smaller by the second as the attackers pulled the battle closer, shrinking the distance until rifles would no longer be the primary instruments of survival. The Marines' magazines thinned to the last few. Their machine gun belts dwindled to the final links. Their hands began to tremble not from fear, but from the cumulative shockwave of repeated explosions. One of them could feel a distant numbness spreading through his right arm, but still he worked the bolt, forcing his fingers to move in stubborn imitation of the training that had once felt so abstract. Then, from a distance that felt impossibly far and yet intimately near, another sound rolled over the jungle. Not drums, not cries, a different thunder, the deep, distant boom of artillery. For a moment, it seemed unreal, like an echo from another battle. But then, seconds later, the sharp whine of incoming shells sliced through the air. The Marines pressed themselves against the ground, recognizing the sound as instinctively as they recognized their own breath. The first barrage landed beyond the hill, somewhere behind the Japanese lines. Explosions rose in tall columns of fire and earth, silhouetting the charging troops against sudden bursts of light. The artillery was not perfect. It could not be, not with the lines so close and the jungle so dense. But it struck deep enough into the rear of the charging force to tear holes in their momentum. Men were thrown into the air. Others dropped and did not rise. The hillside shook with a violence that dwarfed the smaller grenade blasts. The attackers faltered. For the first time since the full assault began, the charge did not simply bend and reform. It hesitated. The artillery came again. This time the shells landed closer, straddling the midsection of the slope. The blast waves collided with the bodies of attackers and defenders alike, sending shockwaves through lungs and bones. The Marines clung to the ground, feeling the world roar above them. When the dust and smoke cleared fractionally, the shape of the battlefield had changed. The massed assault no longer surged as a single living organism. It had broken into fragments, clusters of men scattered across the slope, some still pushing upward, others crouched in startled confusion, others already retreating instinctively toward the relative cover of the trees. The Banzai charge, the final all-or-nothing commitment, had met something even more indifferent than courage: massed impersonal artillery fire. The Japanese troops, still on their feet, tried to rally, some gesturing, some pushing forward on willpower alone. But the charge had lost the brutal unity that gave it its strength. The 8 Marines, battered and half-deaf, saw this and understood that the moment they had been fighting toward, not consciously but in every action, had finally arrived. This was the break, the instant in which the impossible might tilt into merely improbable. They rose. Their shoulders ached. Their joints screamed, but they rose. They fired their last magazines with a cold precision honed by hours of survival. Each shot now mattered more than any that had come before. There was no reserve, no backup, no more time. Bullets found bodies struggling to reorganize on the slope. Attacks that might have regained momentum were torn apart before they could fully form. Men dropped rifles and stumbled backward. Others slid down the hill. The cries began to change. The unified roar of attack fractured into individual shouts, some still defiant, others edged with confusion and pain. The artillery pounded the jungle a final time, then ceased, leaving behind an echoing stillness broken only by the crackle of small fires and the distant thud of shells falling elsewhere along the front. The charge did not resume. The remnants of the attacking force melted back into the trees, some dragging wounded, others limping alone. The hillside, once alive with violent motion, now lay heavy and still. Hill 42 remained in American hands. 8 Marines, exhausted, bloodied, half-spent, still lay along its crest. For a long time, none of them moved. Not because they lacked the will, but because their bodies needed the simple act of remaining still in a world that had finally stopped trying to tear itself apart around them. Their ears rang with the ghosts of drums and cries. Their muscles twitched with leftover adrenaline. Their eyes traced the slope below, trying to reconcile the scale of what they had just endured with the narrow patch of earth that had hosted it. The jungle around them slowly began to breathe again. Insects returned. Distant birds called. The mist began to lift, revealing not the faceless tide of attackers that had seemed endless, but an ordinary landscape scarred by extraordinary violence. Later, when reinforcements finally reached Hill 42 and medics moved among the 8 defenders, taking stock of wounds and muttered assessments, officers would try to put the battle in a language that could fit inside after-action reports. Numbers would be listed. Enemy dead estimated. Ammunition expenditures recorded. Artillery timing noted. The narrative would speak of an attempted breakthrough halted by a combination of infantry resistance and supporting fire. Accurate, in a way, but incomplete. What cannot be fully captured in reports was the lived reality of those hours. The way time had stretched and compressed, the way each second of the charge had felt like an entire separate war, the way 8 men had become, whether they wanted it or not, a living hinge on which hundreds of lives turned. In the months and years that followed, stories of Hill 42 drifted across units and theaters, told in tents and on transports and in barracks far from the jungle where it had happened. The details shifted slightly in each retelling, but one core truth remained. There had been a day when an overwhelming Banzai charge had crashed against a small, exhausted group of Marines, and the hill did not fall. For the men who had lain on that crest, the memory never simplified into legend. It remained complex, heavy, textured with images they could not unsee. The surge of bodies, the sound of drums, the feel of the earth buckling beneath explosions, the faces of attackers close enough to touch, the strange mingling of terror and absolute clarity when there was no time left to hesitate. They understood something that no clean paragraph could express. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to remain at a post when every instinct screams to run. Hill 42 was not marked on most maps. It held no permanent monument. The jungle would reclaim its slopes in time, covering scars with new growth. But for a few hours on a humid Pacific morning, it was the center of a small universe in which 8 men took everything war could throw at them and held. And somewhere behind that hill, men who never knew how close disaster had come lived to see another sunrise.